Let us now consider a couple who, like Fromm's subjects, conform to the second type of myth. People who have crossed the line and descended into radical, likely inescapable evil. It is the case of Bobby and his parents. It was February in the middle of my first year of psychiatric training. Bobby, a 15-year-old boy, had been admitted the night before with a diagnosis of depression. I read the note written in his chart by the admitting psychiatrist. Bobby's older brother, Stuart, 16, committed suicide this past June, shooting himself in the head with his .22 caliber rifle. Bobby initially seemed to handle his only sibling's death rather well. But from the beginning of the school in September, his academic performance has been poor. By Thanksgiving, he had become obviously depressed. His parents, who seemed very concerned, tried to talk to him, but he has become more and more uncommunicative, particularly since Christmas. Although there is no previous history of antisocial behavior, yesterday Bobby stole a car by himself, crashed it, he had never driven before, and was apprehended by the police. Because of his age, he was released into his parents' custody, and they were advised to seek immediate psychiatric evaluation for him. The aide brought Bobby into my office. His slightly long, unwashed hair fell forward over his eyes, so that it was difficult to see his face, particularly as he kept his gaze riveted on the floor. I shook his limp hand and motioned him to sit down. "I'm Dr. Peck, Bobby," I said. "I'm going to be your doctor. How are you feeling?" Bobby did not answer. He started picking at a small sore on the back of his hand. I noted that there were a number of such sores on both his forearms and hands. "Are you nervous being here in the hospital?" No answer. Bobby was really digging into that sore. Inwardly, I winced at the damage he was doing to his flesh. "I stole a car, and the police said I had to come here." "It's a pretty scary thing to steal a car, especially when you're not used to driving. Something very strong had to be pushing you to do it. Do you know what that something was?" No answer. I didn't really expect one. 15-year-old boys who are in trouble aren't likely to be very verbal, particularly when they're depressed, and Bobby was clearly very depressed. His face, when he inadvertently raised his gaze, was dull and expressionless. It was the kind of face I had seen in the movies of concentration camp survivors. Dazed, apathetic, hopeless. "Do you feel sad?" I asked. "I don't know." "I suspect you have some very good reasons to feel sad," I told him. "I know that your brother Stuart committed suicide last summer. Were you close to him?" "Yes." "His death must have made you hurt and confused," I said. No reaction, except that maybe he dug a little deeper into one of the sores on his arm. "How about your parents?" I asked. "What can you tell me about them?" "They're good to me." "That's nice. How are they good to you?" "They drive me to scout meetings." "Yes, that's good," I commented. "Of course, that's the kind of thing parents are supposed to do. How do you get along with them?" "Okay." "No problems?" "Sometimes I'm mean to them." "Oh, like how?" "I hurt them." "How do you hurt them, Bobby?" I asked. "Like when I stole the car. That hurt them," Bobby said, not with triumph, but with a dreary, hopeless heaviness. "Do you think maybe that's why you stole the car? To hurt them?" "No." "Can you think of any other ways you've hurt your parents?" Bobby didn't answer. After a long pause, I said, "Well, I just know I hurt them." "Do they punish you?" "No, they're good to me." Then how do you know you hurt them? They yell at me. Oh, what are some of the things they yell at you for? I don't know. Bobby was feverishly picking at his sores now, and his head had drooped as far as it would go. I felt it would be best if I steered my questions to more neutral subjects. It's not long since Christmas, I said. What did you get for Christmas? Nothing much. Your parents must have given you something. A gun. A gun? I repeated stupidly. Yes. What kind of gun? A .22 rifle. There was a long moment of silence. I felt as if I had lost my bearings. I understand that it was with a .22 rifle that your brother killed himself. Yes. Was that what you asked for Christmas? No. What did you ask for? A tennis racket. But you got the gun instead? Yes. How did you feel getting the same kind of gun that your brother had? It wasn't the same kind of gun. I'm sorry, I said. I thought they were the same kind of gun. It wasn't the same kind of gun, Bobby replied. It was the gun. You mean your parents gave you your brother's gun for Christmas? The one he shot himself with? Yes. How did it make you feel getting your brother's gun for Christmas? I don't know. No, I don't expect you could know, I said. Tell me, do you have any relatives that you see? Some. Any that you like? I like my Aunt Helen. I thought perhaps I detected a faint sign of enthusiasm in his reply. Would you like it if your Aunt Helen comes to visit you while you're here in the hospital, I asked. She lives quite far away. But if she came anyway? If she wanted to. Again, I felt in him the faintest glimmer of hope, and in myself. I would be getting in touch with Aunt Helen. The next day, I saw Bobby's parents. They were, they told me, hard-working people. He was a tool and die maker, an expert machinist who took pride in the great precision of his craft. She had a job as a secretary in an insurance company and took pride in the neatness of their home. They went to the Lutheran church every Sunday. He drank beer in moderation on the weekends. She belonged to a Thursday night women's bowling league. Of average stature, neither handsome nor ugly, they were the upper crust of the blue-collar class. Quiet, orderly, solid. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to the tragedy that had befallen them. First Stuart, and now Bobby. I've cried myself out, Doctor, the mother said. Stuart's suicide was a surprise to you? I asked. Totally, a complete shock, the father answered. He was such a well-adjusted boy. Everyone liked him. Had he seemed depressed before he killed himself? No, not at all. He seemed just like his old self. Of course, he was quiet and didn't tell us much of what was on his mind. Did he leave a note? No. Have any of your relatives on either side had a mental illness or serious depression or killed themselves? Oh, Doctor, the mother wailed softly, you don't think that there's any chance that Bobby might also do something to himself, do you? You hadn't thought of Bobby being in danger? I asked. No, not until now, the father replied. But I understand that Bobby's been depressed for some time, I remarked. Didn't that worry you? Well, it worried us, of course, the father responded. But we thought it was natural, what with his brother's death and all. You didn't think of taking him to see someone like a psychiatrist? I continued. No, of course not, the father replied again. this time with an edge of annoyance. We thought he would get over it. We had no idea that it might be this serious. I understand that Bobby's grades have gone way down in school, I remarked. Yes, it's a shame, his mother responded. He used to be such a good student. Did the school get in touch with you about the problem? The mother looked slightly uncomfortable. Yes, they did. And of course I was concerned too. I even took time off from my job to go in for a conference. Did anyone from the school suggest that Bobby see a psychiatrist? No, the mother answered. She seemed to have so rapidly regained her composure. I wasn't sure she had ever lost it. They did suggest he might get some counseling. If they had suggested a psychiatrist, we would have done something about it. Yes, then we would have known it was something serious, the father added. But because they said counseling, we thought they were just concerned about his grades. Not that we weren't concerned about his grades, too. Well, that's another thing, Doctor, the mother continued, more on the offensive than the defensive. It's not that easy for us to take Bobby here or there during weekdays. We're both working people, you know. And these counseling people, they don't work on weekends. We can't be just taking off from our jobs every day. We've got a living to make, you know. It didn't seem as if it would be fruitful for me to engage Bobby's parents in an argument over available counseling services. I decided to raise the issue of Aunt Helen. You know, I said, I may decide that Bobby will need a complete change of scene for a good while. Bobby mentioned his Aunt Helen to me. Perhaps she might be willing to take it. The mother jumped in. Did Bobby tell you he doesn't want to live with us? She demanded. No, we haven't even talked about the subject yet, I replied. I'm only seeing what all the options are. Who is Aunt Helen? She's my sister, the mother answered. But I don't think it would work out. Oh? Well, Helen and I aren't close. No, not close at all. Even though you don't like your sister, Bobby seems to have some positive feeling for her, and that's important. Look, Doctor, the father interjected, I don't know what you're insinuating. You're asking all these questions like you were a policeman or something. We haven't done anything wrong. We've worked hard for that boy. We've been good parents. My stomach was feeling queasier moment by moment. I'm concerned about the Christmas present you gave Bobby, I said. Christmas present? The parent seemed confused. Yes, I understand you gave him a gun. That's right. Was that what he asked for? How should I know what he asked for? The father demanded belligerently. Then immediately his manner turned plaintive. I can't remember what he asked for. A lot's happened to us, you know. This has been a difficult year for us. I can believe it has been, I said. But why did you give him a gun? Why? Why not? It's a good present for a boy his age. Most boys would give their eye teeth for a gun. I should think, I said slowly, that since your only other child has killed himself with a gun, that you wouldn't feel so kindly toward them. You're one of those anti-gun people, are you? The father asked me, faintly belligerent again. Well, I'm no gun nut myself, but it does seem to me that guns aren't the problem. It's the people who use them. To an extent, I agree with you, I said. Stewart didn't kill himself simply because he had a gun. There must have been some other reason more important. Do you know what that reason might have been? No, we've already told you we didn't even know that Stewart was depressed. That's right. Stewart was depressed. People don't commit suicide unless they're depressed. Since you didn't know Stewart was depressed, there was perhaps no reason for you to worry about him having a gun. But you did know Bobby was depressed. You knew he was depressed well before Christmas. Well before you gave him the gun. Please, Doctor, you don't seem to understand, the mother said ingratiatingly, taking over from her husband. We really didn't know it was this serious. We just thought he was upset over his brother. So you gave him his brother's suicide weapon? Not any gun, that particular gun. The father took the lead again. We couldn't afford to get him a new gun. I don't know why you're picking on us. We gave him the best present we could. Money doesn't grow on trees, you know. We're just ordinary working people. We could have sold the gun and made money, but we didn't. We kept it so we could give Bobby a good present. Did you think how that present might seem to Bobby? I asked. What do you mean? I mean that giving him his brother's suicide weapon was like telling him to walk in his brother's shoes, like telling him to go out and kill himself too. We didn't tell him anything of the sort. Of course not. But did you think that it might possibly seem that way to Bobby? No, we didn't think about that. We're not educated people like you. We haven't been to college and learned all kinds of fancy ways of thinking. We're just simple working people. We can't be expected to think of all these things. Perhaps not, I said, but that's what worries me, because these things need to be thought of. We stared at each other for a long moment. How did they feel, I wondered. Certainly they didn't seem to feel guilty. Angry? Frightened? Victimized? I didn't know. I didn't feel any empathy for them. I only knew how I felt. I felt repelled by them. I'd like your signatures giving me permission to talk to Helen, Bobby's aunt, was all I could say. Well, you'll not have mine, the father protested. I'll not have you taking this out of the family, you acting so superior like you're a judge or something. If you don't want to cooperate, I said, in a tired but measured tone, then you're going to have a real judge on your hands. Oh, my husband's just being silly, Doctor, Bobby's mother exclaimed with a gay, charming smile. Of course we'll sign permission. The next day, I got in touch with Aunt Helen. She and her husband came to see me right away. They understood the situation quickly and seemed quite caring. They too were working people, but were willing to have Bobby live with them. I contacted a most competent psychiatrist in Helen's town who agreed to take on Bobby's case for long-term outpatient psychotherapy. Bobby improved rapidly with several visits from Helen, the prospect of a new living situation, and the care he received from the nurses and aides. By the time he was discharged to Helen's care, 3 weeks after his admission to the hospital, the sores on his arms and hands were only scars, and he was able to joke with the staff. 6 months later, I heard from Helen that he seemed to be doing well, and that his grades had come up again. From his psychiatrist, I heard that he had developed a trusting therapeutic relationship, but was only barely beginning to approach facing the psychological reality of his parents and their treatment of him. When he first came to the hospital, Bobby was literally gouging holes in himself, destroying the surface of himself piece by piece. It was as if he felt there was something bad, something evil inside him underneath the surface of his skin, and he was digging at himself in order to get it out. Why? If it happens that someone close to us commits suicide, our first response after the initial shock, if we are normally human, with a normal human conscience, will be to wonder what we did wrong. So it must have been for Bobby. In the days immediately following Stuart's death, he would have remembered all manner of little incidents. That only a week before he had called his brother a stupid slob, that a month before he had kicked him in the midst of a fight, that when Stuart picked on him, he often wished that his brother would somehow be removed from the face of the earth. Bobby felt responsible, at least to some degree, for Stuart's death. What should have happened at this point And what would have happened in a healthy home would have been for his parents to begin reassuring him. They should have talked to him about Stuart's suicide. They should have explained that even though they themselves didn't realize it, Stuart must have been mentally ill. They should have told him that people don't commit suicide because of everyday squabbles or sibling rivalry. They ought to have said that if anyone was responsible, it was they, the parents, the ones who had the biggest influence on Stuart's life. But as far as I could ascertain, Bobby had been given none of this reassurance. When the reassurance he needed was not forthcoming, Bobby became visibly depressed. His grades fell. At this point, his parents should have rectified the situation, or, lacking the insight to do so themselves, should have sought professional help. But they failed to do so, despite its actually having been suggested to them by the school. It was likely that Bobby even interpreted the lack of attention his depression was receiving as a confirmation of his guilt. Of course, no one was concerned about his depression, he felt. He deserved it. He deserved to feel miserable. It was appropriate that he should feel guilty. Consequently, by Christmas, Bobby was already judging himself to be an evil criminal. Then, unsolicited, he was given his brother's murder weapon. Was he to think, my parents are evil people, and out of their evil desire my destruction, just as they probably destroyed my brother? Hardly. Nor could he, even with his 15-year-old mind, think to himself, my parents gave me the gun out of a mixture of laziness, thoughtlessness, and cheapness. So they don't love me very well, so what? Since he already believed himself to be evil and lacked the maturity to see his parents with any clarity, there was but one interpretation open to him: to believe the gun an appropriate message telling him, take your brother's suicide weapon and do likewise. You deserve to die. Fortunately, Bobby did not immediately do likewise. He chose what was probably his only other psychological option: to publicly label himself a criminal so that he might be punished for his evil, and society might be protected from him by means of his imprisonment. He stole a car. In a very real sense, he stole it that he might live. All this has been a supposition. I had no way of knowing precisely what had occurred in Bobby's mind. For children and young adolescents, almost all mental activity is unconscious. They feel, they conclude, and they act with precious little awareness of what they are about. So we must deduce from their behavior what is going on. Yet we have learned enough to know that such deductions can be remarkably accurate. From such deductions, we can arrive at one of the laws of child development, this one specific to the problem of evil. When a child is grossly confronted by significant evil in its parents, it will most likely misinterpret the situation and believe that the evil resides in itself. We can see then that Bobby was not himself so much sick as he was responding in the way that most children would, in a predictable fashion, to the peculiar evil sickness of his parents. Although identified as the one who had something wrong with him, the locus of evil in the total situation lay not in him, but elsewhere. Let us turn now to the parents, the true source of the problem. Appropriately, they should have been formally identified as the sick ones. They should have been the ones to receive treatment. Yet they did not. Why not? The first and perhaps most compelling reason is that they did not want it. Bobby's parents gave many indications that they would have rejected any type of therapy I might have offered them. They did not even pretend to demonstrate any guilt over Stuart's suicide. They reacted only with rationalization and belligerence to my intimations that they had been remiss in not earlier seeking professional help for Bobby, and that their judgment had been poor at best in their choice of his Christmas present. Rather than acknowledging any deficit, they refused to assume any blame on the grounds that they were working people. I sensed that even if by some miracle they had been willing to undergo psychotherapy, in their case it would have failed. It is a sad state of affairs that the sicker the patients, the more dishonest in their behavior and distorted in their thinking, the less able we are to help them with any degree of success. When they are very distorted and dishonest, it seems impossible. Among themselves, therapists feel overwhelmed by the labyrinthian mass of lies and twisted motives and distorted communications into which we will be drawn if we attempt to work with such people in the intimate relationship of psychotherapy. This was the case in dealing with Bobby's parents. I felt overwhelmed by the sickness I sensed in them. There is one other reason I didn't try to work with Bobby's parents. I simply didn't like them. It was even more than that. They revolted me. I could hardly stand being in the same room with them. I felt unclean in their presence. Not only would they have rejected my therapy, I rejected them. The feeling that a healthy person often experiences in a relationship with an evil one is revulsion. It is a powerful emotion that causes us to immediately want to avoid, to escape the revolting presence. Because of the intense negativity of the reaction, there is a profound tendency for psychotherapists to avoid sustaining relationships with evil clients. There is another reaction that the evil frequently engender in us: confusion. Describing an encounter with an evil person, one woman wrote, "It was as if I'd suddenly lost my ability to think." Once again, this reaction is quite appropriate. Lies confuse. The evil are the people of the lie, deceiving others as they also build layer upon layer of self-deception. Knowing so little about the nature of evil, we currently lack the skill to heal it. Our therapeutic ineptness is hardly remarkable, however, in view of the fact that we have not yet discerned evil as a specific disease. It is a thesis of this book that evil can be defined as a specific form of mental illness and should be subject to at least the same intensity of scientific investigation that we would devote to some other major psychiatric disease. As I review the case of Bobby and his parents after a span of 20 years, I know now that Bobby's parents were evil. I did not know it then. I felt their evil, but had no name for it. The name did not exist in our professional vocabulary. As scientists rather than priests, we were not supposed to think in such terms. To name something correctly gives us a certain amount of power over it. At the time I saw Bobby's parents, I did not know the nature of the force with which I was dealing. I was revolted by it, but not curious about it. I avoided dealing with them not simply out of a healthy respect for that force, but also because I was afraid of it. Unknowingly afraid. Today I am afraid of it still, but it is not a blind fear. Knowing its name, I know something of the dimensions of that force. Because I have that much of safe ground on which to stand, I can afford to be curious as to its nature. I can afford to move toward it. To more fully understand Bobby's parents and others like them, it is necessary that first we draw the distinction between evil and ordinary sin. It is not their sins per se that characterize evil people. Rather, it is the subtlety and persistence and consistency of their sins. This is because the central defect of the evil is not the sin, but the refusal to acknowledge it. Bobby's parents, except for their evil, are most ordinary. They live down the street, on any street. They may be rich or poor, educated or uneducated. There is little that is dramatic about them. They are not designated criminals. More often than not, they will be solid citizens, Sunday school teachers, policemen, or bankers, and active in the PTA. How can this be? How can they be evil and not designated as criminals? The key lies in the word designated. They are criminals in that they commit crimes against life and liveliness. Their crimes are so subtle and covert that they cannot be clearly designated as crimes. I have spent a good deal of time working in prison with designated criminals. Almost never have I experienced them as evil people. People in jail can almost always be assigned a standard psychiatric diagnosis of one kind or another. The men and women I talk about, such as Bobby's parents, have no such obvious defects and do not fall clearly into our routine psychiatric pigeonholes. This is not because the evil are healthy. It is simply because we have not yet developed a definition for their disease. Since I distinguish between evil people and ordinary criminals, I also obviously make the distinction between evil as a personality characteristic and evil deeds. In other words, evil deeds do not an evil person make. Otherwise, we should all be evil, because we all do evil things. Sinning is most broadly defined as missing the mark. This means that sin is nothing more and nothing less than a failure to be continually perfect. Because it is impossible for us to be continually perfect, we are all sinners. We routinely fail to do the very best of which we are capable. And with each failure, we commit a crime of sorts against God, our neighbors, or ourselves, if not frankly against the law. Of course, there are crimes of greater and lesser magnitude. It is a mistake, however, to think of sin or evil as a matter of degree. It may seem less odious to cheat the rich than the poor, but it is still cheating. If evil people cannot be defined by the illegality of their deed or the magnitude of their sins, then how are we to define them? The answer is by the consistency of their sins. While usually subtle, their destructiveness is remarkably consistent. This is because those who have crossed over the line are characterized by the absolute refusal to tolerate the sense of their own sinfulness. I commented that George, blessed by guilt, managed to turn away from becoming evil. Because he was willing, at least to a rudimentary degree, to tolerate the sense of his own sinfulness, he was able to reject his pact with the devil. Had he not borne the pain of the guilties he experienced over the pact, his moral deterioration would have continued. More than anything else, it is the sense of our own sinfulness that prevents any of us from undergoing a similar deterioration. A predominant characteristic of the behavior of those I call evil is scapegoating. Because in their hearts they consider themselves above reproach, they must lash out at anyone who does reproach them. They sacrifice others to preserve their self-image of perfection. Evil, then, is most often committed in order to scapegoat. And the people I label as evil are chronic scapegoaters. They attack others instead of facing their own failures. As life often threatens their self-image of perfection, evil people are often busily engaged in hating and destroying that life, usually in the name of righteousness. The fault, however, may not be so much that they hate life as that they do not hate the sinful part of themselves. I doubt that Bobby's parents deliberately wanted to kill Stuart or him. I suspect that their murderous behavior was totally dictated by an extreme form of self-protectiveness which invariably sacrificed others rather than themselves. What is the cause of this failure of self-hatred? This failure to be displeasing to oneself, which seems to be the central sin at the root of the scapegoating behavior of those I call evil. The cause is not, I believe, an absent conscience. There are people, both in and out of jail, who seem utterly lacking in conscience or superego. Psychiatrists call them psychopaths or sociopaths. Guiltless, they not only commit crimes, but may often do so with a kind of reckless abandon that is not particularly characterized by scapegoating. This is hardly the case with those I call evil. Utterly dedicated to preserving their self-image of perfection, they are unceasingly engaged in the effort to maintain the appearance of moral purity. They worry about this a great deal. They are acutely sensitive to social norms and what others might think of them. Like Bobby's parents, they dress well, go to work on time, pay their taxes, and outwardly seem to live lives that are above reproach. The words image and appearance and outwardly are crucial to the understanding of the morality of the evil. While they seem to lack any motivation to be good, they intensely desire to appear good. Their goodness is all on a level of pretense. It is, in effect, a lie. This is why they are called the people of the lie. Actually, the lie is designed not so much to deceive others as to deceive themselves. They cannot or will not tolerate the pain of self-reproach. The decorum with which they lead their lives is maintained as a mirror in which they can see themselves reflected righteously. Yet the self-deceit would be unnecessary if the evil had no sense of right and wrong. We lie only when we are attempting to cover up something we know to be illicit. Some rudimentary form of conscience must precede the act of lying. There is no need to hide unless we first feel that something needs to be hidden. We come now to a sort of paradox. I have said that evil people feel themselves to be perfect. At the same time, however, I think they have an unacknowledged sense of their own evil nature. Indeed, it is this very sense from which they are frantically trying to flee. The essential component of evil is not the absence of a sense of sin or imperfection, but the unwillingness to tolerate that sense. At one and the same time, the evil are aware of their evil and desperately trying to avoid the awareness. Rather than blissfully lacking a sense of morality, like the psychopath, they are continually engaged in sweeping the evidence of their evil under the rug of their own consciousness. For everything they did, Bobby's parents had a rationalization, a whitewash good enough for themselves, even if not for me. The problem is not a defect of conscience, but the effort to deny the conscience its due. We become evil by attempting to hide from ourselves. The wickedness of the evil is not committed directly, but indirectly as part of this cover-up process. Evil originates not in the absence of guilt, but in the effort to escape it. In The Road Less Traveled, I suggested that laziness, or the desire to escape legitimate suffering, lies at the root of all mental illness. What distinguishes the evil, however, from the rest of us mentally ill sinners is the specific type of pain they cannot tolerate. The pain of their own conscience, the pain of the realization of their own sinfulness and imperfection. If the central defect of the evil is not one of conscience, then where does it reside? The essential psychological problem of human evil, I believe, is a particular variety of narcissism that Erich Fromm called malignant narcissism. Narcissism or self-absorption takes many forms. Malignant narcissism is characterized by an unsubmitted will. All adults who are mentally healthy submit themselves one way or another to something higher than themselves, be it God or truth or love or some other ideal. To a greater or lesser degree, all mentally healthy individuals submit themselves to the demands of their own conscience. Not so the evil, however. In the conflict between their guilt and their will, it is the guilt that must go, and the will that must win. They are men and women of extraordinary willfulness. There is a remarkable power in the manner in which they attempt to control others. Indeed, it is almost tempting to think that the problem of evil lies in the will itself. Perhaps the evil are born so inherently strong-willed that it is impossible for them ever to submit their will. Yet I think it is characteristic of all great people that they are extremely strong-willed, whether their greatness be for good or for evil. The strong will, the power and authority of Jesus radiates from the Gospels, just as Hitler's did from Mein Kampf. But Jesus' will was that of his Father, and Hitler's that of his own. The crucial distinction is between willingness and willfulness. There are many ways to look at the genesis of human evil. The fact of the matter is that some of us are very good and some of us very evil, and most of us are somewhere in between. We might therefore think of human good and evil as a kind of continuum. As individuals, we can move ourselves one way or another along the continuum. Just as there is a tendency for the rich to get richer, however, and the poor to get poorer, so there seems to be a tendency for the good to get better and the bad to get worse. Erich Fromm saw the genesis of human evil as a developmental process. We are not created evil or forced to be evil, but we become evil slowly over time through a long series of choices. I applaud his view, particularly its emphasis upon choice and will. I think it is correct as far as it goes, but I do not think it is the whole truth of the matter. On the one hand, it does not take into account the tremendous forces that tend to shape the being of a young child before it has much opportunity to exercise its will in true freedom of choice. On the other hand, it perhaps underestimates the very power of the will itself. In my view, the issue of free will, like so many great truths, is a paradox. On the one hand, free will is a reality. We can be free to choose with conditioning or other factors. On the other hand, we cannot choose freedom. There are only two states of being: submission to God and goodness, or the refusal to submit to anything beyond one's own will, which refusal automatically enslaves one to the forces of evil. We must ultimately belong either to God or the devil. We must choose.